Welcome to the Sixsess Consultancy's Just Great People podcast, the podcast that introduces you to ordinary people who've done extraordinary things. My name is Barry Eustace, and I'd like to introduce you to today's guest. Welcome to the Sixsess Consultancy's Target Operating Model course question and answer session on the Strategy Mirror with David Winders, the Sixsess Consultancy's Principal Target Operating Model Facilitator. David, welcome. Please, could you take us through the strategic theme drivers and mirror?
I'd just like to take you through the sliders, really, one by one, 1 to 6 here. I'm going to start off with the cost leadership versus differentiated one. This comes from Michael Porter's work, where he defined a series of generic strategies, and I think this still holds true today. Before we move on, we need to talk about what cost leadership is, because that confuses people. It is not about trying to deliver things at the lowest price, and that's a common mistake that people make. Cost leadership is where you operate in a marketplace that has a commoditized product, or where it's highly price sensitive, and the only way to become the market leader and make some money out of this is to do things, the same thing, cheaper or less costly than somebody else. So typical industries would be things like motor vehicle insurance, for example, where you leverage your scale, leverage the efficiency of how you do it, and that's how you make your money. So that's a very different view. A lot of people on training courses get a bit confused with this. They think that cost leadership is about offering the lower price. It's not. Differentiated is fairly easy to come to terms with. It's about offering different products with good, differentiated benefits, and people do business with you because your product is exciting and different and to somebody else. So in an operating model sense, cost leadership organizations tend to be quite process orientated. They like high volume processes, simple product offerings, efficient ways of doing things. So you'll get lots of process charts, lots of operating procedures. Generally speaking, slightly lower skilled employees. Churn on employees is fairly high. Employees tend to be lower paid quite often than in differentiated organizations. There's lots of offshoring going on here to other countries where the arbitrage of labor is cheaper. Lots of outsourcing. So it's very process orientated, technology based, automated, simple. Keep costs down, basically, because your scale and the ability to reduce cost is basically delivers your existence. Differentiated is doing exciting things, offering wonderful products that do all sorts of different bits and pieces, lots of ad hoc activity. We often get case management being more appropriate here, so people are not following process flows. They're professional individuals who will adapt their knowledge to solve individual problems that come up, or offerings that come up. Relationships tend to be very personal with their customers quite often, whereas in cost leadership, they don't really want to speak to you on the telephone because it costs money, so they want you online or that type of thing. So that's the version. So those two are quite diametrically opposed to each other, really, and hence why Michael Porter sticks the concept of stuck in the middle, where organizations try to be both, and it's very difficult to do, as you can well imagine. So because the two are, as I say, very much opposed to each other. So moving on to number 2 now, where we have the centralized versus devolved. I've mapped this across really to top-down deliberate strategy and bottom-up emergent strategy here. So these organizations that are centralized tend to create a strategy at the high level and then cascade that strategy down. They manage top-down. They tend to do management by objectives coming down through the organization. Information goes down through the various layers of the hierarchy, and then information comes back up through the hierarchy. So communication is relatively slow and complex. People in those organizations tend to know their place. They tend to ask for permission to do things. It's sort of fairly structured environment, really. Devolved, bottom up. Customer-facing departments make decisions and change according to what they see in the marketplace. They don't have to ask for permission to do as much as people in centralized organizations do. Control is less. You could argue that a lot of people say that devolved bottom up is much more dynamic and more exciting and better, but Probably not, because if centralised is very well controlled, so the governance is strong. So in sectors where you have highly regulated environment, you need to be centralised because you just got to do it. It's different. They're obviously, unlike cost leadership versus differentiated, you can be anywhere between the top and the bottom of the mix, and that's quite common actually. Most large organisations tend to be more towards the top side of this, centralised. They tend to be centrally controlled. Smaller organisations tend to be more devolved, bottom up. So do they have strategy at all is the question at the bottom of the emergent one. In many cases, no, they just do what they do and respond as the world moves forward. Okay, moving on to number 3, we've got the resource-based view versus marketing. Resource-based view is based on Barney's work, where he says that capabilities are created in an organisation, and the organisation looks out to the outside world to see how these capabilities and activities and knowledge and equipment that it has, and how can it find customers to use these things. Marketing very much is the other way around. It's looking to the outside world to say, oh, what do people want, and how can we provide and fulfill those needs? So there is a bit of a mix there. Some industries are highly resource-based view, chemical companies, heavy industries, because they build plants that last for 20 or 30 years, and they have to leverage those fixed costs. Marketing organizations, the opposite extreme would be things like a games company, where they can just create what they want and change stuff. But to be fair, I think in most organizations, there's a bit of a mix of the two. Sometimes a more emphasis on one or the other, depending on sector. Now, number 4 is quite interesting, because this actually relates to both two things, really. It relates to the sector. So if you're an organisation that's highly regulated, for example, you're going to be quite transparent to the outside world, and therefore have to behave in a very different way. And therefore your operating model will be constructed in a way to provide lots of governance and tracking of what you do, why you did it. Decision making is highly regulated and controlled within the organisation. So the idea of transparent to the outside and opaque to the outside is that, let's look at the two extremes. So opaque-wise, if I'm a small plumbing business, the outside world actually doesn't care too much about me, really. I'm not going to appear in the newspaper unless do something criminal. I'm not going to be highly regulated. I don't have governments having specialist regulation over me particularly. The opposite would be a market leader. I think Centrica is a good example here. Anything that it does wrong, immediately the press will be on top of them, and they are very much in the news. I think legal structure is important here. So a PLC has to publish its accounts publicly. It has to adhere to certain governance based on the Bank of England and the FCA and various other organisations. It's highly regulated because it is a PLC. So what does this mean to the operating model? So if you are having to do things and be very open to the outside world, you're going to have much higher levels of management processes in there, lots of governance. You can't just simply make a decision low down in the organisation. You have to justify why you made the decision, because somebody's going to ask you questions. Did you go through the right procedures to get to these things? So this is quite interesting, actually, that bigger organisations when they go from sole trader to partnership through to private limited company to PLC to government organisations, because they're very, very visible to the outside world and to the press, they have to be constructed in a very different, more bureaucratic way rather than organisations that just do what they do basically behind the scenes. Now, moving on, we've got two interesting ones here. So risk adverse versus risk taking there's a bit of a connection between transparent and opaque, because obviously if you're transparent, you're fairly risk averse because you have to behave that way. So why have I got two different ones here? So the transparent to opaque is almost mandatory. So you are what you are, both in legal structure and your sector. So you have to respond to that. There's no choice to it. The other one, risk averse versus risk taking, is more of a cultural issue here. So all of the bits that I've talked about, the management control and the governance, are the same, but they've got different drivers. So this is the cultural thing. So if you are run by a risk-averse sole trader, for example, even though you are opaque, you are perhaps going to do things in a much more methodical way than somebody who's a bit more gung-ho. Okay, moving on to the last one, I want to keep this presentation relatively brief now, is structured versus fluid. This is how you respond. So there are connections here. So structured pairs off with centralized back at number 2 quite a bit here. So one drives the other, if you like. So it's your process of change. So if you're a highly structured organization, you're probably going to have lots of business cases. You're going to have project management, program management. You're going to have delegation of authority, where it's clearly defined who can do what, lots of rules, lots of regulations. If you're fluid, you're potentially going to have more agile activity, and I use agile with both a big A and a small a, in that you might be doing things like iterating, trying things out, minimum viable product, that kind of thing. In a structured environment, you'll probably plan everything in a waterfall fashion, step by step by step, in a highly formal way. So that's structure versus fluid. Now, by using these 6 these drivers or levers, if you like, it enables you to ask questions about whether your operating model fits within what you think you actually are. So if there are things that you are doing that don't really make sense in terms of when you thought about looking in the mirror at your organization, then you can ask the question whether your operating model needs to be the way it is. So what are the benefits of all this, or is this just some academic sort of evaluation? I think the benefit is basically it's enabling people to understand their operating model, understand that operating models are different for various reasons. And this enables people to think outside their current situation and explore the why of the way that they are. And in summary, that's what it is. So it's an exploration of why and a reflection of strategy, looking at why strategy affects operating model and how the operating model is a response to strategy, but also why does the strategy create these various things by breaking it down into these 6 levers. Obviously, there's a lot more depth to this, which we explore in the course, and in fact, there is quite a large document which we also provide, which details this in a lot more expanded fashion. So let's move on a little bit here. Let's have a look at some examples very, very briefly, just so that you get the idea, really. So here I have a high-tech SME, so let me talk you through that. So they are highly differentiated. Okay, they're certainly not cost leadership, are they? They're doing lots of innovative things, exciting things, so they're down there. So what are they going to have? Are they going to have lots of high-volume repeatable processes? No, they're not. Are they going to have highly skilled staff that can adapt and change and do lots of different things? Yes, they are, aren't they? They tend to be centralized because they're run by an entrepreneur, often, who tells people how things are going to be. So in this example, it's quite structured. They're quite small, generally speaking. And so therefore, the top-down works very well because there's very few people, there's very few layers, and so it's all under control. Very marketing-driven. Okay, there is a bit of RBV in there. Perhaps that slider should be up a little bit because of the capabilities of the technology that they've developed. But in essence, they're responding to market needs. They're looking to the outside world. This example is a private limited company, so it's halfway up there. So it has some obligations. It has some regulation around it in terms of accounting and data protection. They're very much into risk taking. They have a go. This is a have a go company. They're very fluid, they're very adaptable, they're not structured and controlled in certain ways. So if they need to change, they can change very quickly. So that's an example of a small company involved in IT. I've got a banking market leader, which is almost the polar opposite, really, cost leadership. So my goodness me, we've got to get as many customers through these expensive banking systems as we can. We don't want to do lots of different things. We want things to be consistent, repeatable, high volume. It's got to be centralized because probably it's very transparent to the outside world, highly regulated, so those two connect across there quite well. Resource-based view, yeah, definitely. Big computer systems built up over many years, processes, structures. They do They do some marketing. They do some the odd innovative savings account, I suppose, but certainly not down the bottom here. Very transparent to the outside world. Anything goes wrong, they're on the news. So they've got to be very careful about how they do that. Highly regulated, very difficult to change and be innovative because the regulation stops you doing things. The market is very constrained by regulation, so you can't be too imaginative because it's just too much like hard work. Very risk adverse, generally speaking, and highly structured. Second division, this is like a wealth management type bank here. So we've got the same features appearing, but perhaps not in so much emphasis. Okay, so we've got a bit of a problem here because it's a bit stuck in the middle here because they like doing exciting things, but they still need to get some scale here and there. So they've got some issues which they need to consider here. Could be stuck in the middle. Generally centralised top down, principally because they're a highly regulated sector. Lots of management processes in there. Big volumes and computer systems, yes, they have to have them, but they're not as dominant and as important as the previous example. So they're somewhere in the middle there. Yep, they're highly regulated as well. So perhaps not so much as High Street Bank. Well, they are regulated as much as a High Street Bank, but they're not publicly visible as a High Street Bank. They're risk averse because all banking tends to be risk averse because of the nature of its sector. And they are a little bit more fluid than the other ones. See the difference between the two, and it drops down a little bit there. But they still have to be structured because of their regulatory position and their transparency requirements. So the question is, where do you sit? I mean, we can't do that because we're not talking to you today, are we, directly? But have a think about it.
David, thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing our clients on our target operating model course. This is one of many of the presentations that we'll be making that bring the target operating model to life and actually pulls it off the page. David does an extraordinary job of doing exactly that. His depth of understanding on the topic, having been passing this information through some of the largest companies in the UK for over 20 years, will be of great value to you. David, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Barry.
We'll see you on the next target operating model course with the Sixsess Consultancy. And before we go, just a reminder, please do like, do share, and please do subscribe to this podcast and ensure that you pass it on to everybody you know. So that's it for today's Just Great People podcast from the Sixsess Consultancy. We hope and trust you've enjoyed it. Please join us next time, and please do remember to subscribe. Thanks for joining us.